No.
No, we'll tell you.
Okay, we are live.
Right. Good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to hear about the Act 59 process from Trey Martin.
Hello, everybody. About 6 committee members got to visit with me for a few minutes and hear a little bit about my background, but I don't know everybody. Yeah, under the form. Yeah, we took up no issues that are on your agenda. And I talked about having been a school teacher for a long time, but I think more relevant to why I'm here today is that I went to law school at BLS. I'm an environmental lawyer and I've worked for the state. I've worked for private clients and I've worked for NGOs in Vermont, all through those in Vermont, solving complex environmental problems and community development problems. That's how I got to BHCB 4 years ago. And how I got to be here is that, 2 years ago, this body passed Act 59 and VHCB was designated as the entity to do the convening and the organizing for the development of first a conservation inventory, which we published last fall, and a conservation plan that we're getting organized to work on over the course of the next year. So we are named in statute in collaboration with or in consultation with ANR as the entity who's responsible to bring this to you. But we are still I wanted to start with, there's 2 slides that Gus added that I'm going to go past where you met us last week. And I'm sorry, I was really ill and couldn't even get up to watch that morning. But we want you to think of our work on Act 59 as synonymous with the work that we do, that we're bringing the values that we have as an organization to this process. And those values do really revolve around communities and how communities come together to invest and to deliver on this conservation vision in a way that is going to be good for the different sectors and people that we've said conservation is important to across their communities. And so Birdseye is a fantastic example of this. I'm sure Gus told you why he liked that project, but what I loved about it is that it not only added a huge chunk of land to about a 24,000 acre reserve or wildlife management area down in Rutland County, but it did so. It's very inviting to the community. It was something that the community supported in the process of getting funding from BHCB because it allowed hunting, fishing, and trapping, dispersed access for snowshoeing and skiing, for wildlife watching, in addition to having just incredible conservation values, ecological values, and connectivity values. So that's the kind of work that we have done in the past. There are 1,000 stories from around Vermont of our work that are reflected, I think, by the inventory we put together, the work that's happened over, both before and during VHCB's existence in Vermont to protect and conserve land. That are those kinds of stories. That's a story of a whole landscape being protected, at the wildlife, at the 24,000 acre level. But whoops, I went to the very end, not to the next slide. Thank you. No, just kidding. So I'll go to the next one. This is a very different, just as a reminder of who we are. Gus was here, he used this slide, but this is a very different picture of how communities come together to do conservation. What we did down in the Shasberry town line was integrated a lot more in town planning, affordable housing development. And so we were helping that community match their goals to our program, just like we were helping the communities of Poultney and Ira match their goals for wildland conservation to our programs. That's what we have done really well through our partners, is help communities access what we do. But what Act 59 says is let's get a little bit more serious and targeted and focus about that. So when we think about Act 59, it's easy to focus on the goals in the Act, which are to conserve 30% of Vermont's land base by 2030 and 50% by 2050. But the plan that we're going to work on, that we're working to bring to you, is supposed to implement that goal through this vision, right? So we want to protect biodiversity. That is, when you look at the findings of Act 59, what this body decided when it passed this law is that this is a public value in Vermont, and achieving protections for biodiversity and allow the landscape to continue to be connected and functioning is a core public need. And that also supports watershed health, which is critical to life on Earth. It's critical to the species that are here in Vermont and to our enjoyment of hunting, fishing, being in the woods, et cetera. It's critical that we protect that habitat. It's critical that we protect our working farms and forests and that we show them how to, year over year through the act of conservation, we ought to make it possible to continue to invest, right? The act of changing the legal status on a piece of land doesn't necessarily change the resilience value of it. That value is there or not, but oftentimes when we conserve and invest, it also gives us the opportunity to do long-term management and restoration and, either for the business and the enterprise that's using that land and for the land itself. So restoring floodplains, restoring wetlands, building better buffers for agricultural lands. Those are the kinds of things that follow from conservation in ways that we think are really important. Obviously, access to conserved lands is critical. It's across the American the Beautiful initiative that the Biden administration has launched and that continues to be implemented by the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, is providing land where people can, where there is access for all the different groups and user types. So from, trail-based access to non-trail-based access to access that's good for folks with disabilities. This is baked into the vision of Act 59, that our work would continue to enhance and support that, and that we're working towards smart growth. We have a vision in Vermont of compact village centers, downtowns, and places where we focus development and which we're protecting around that with working lands and natural lands. That has for over 100 years been a vision of Vermont that has been the pole star that we've focused our investments towards. And so this act is also that's part of this vision, is continuing to do that. So the nuts and bolts of Act 59 are, let's make investments that increase the amount of permanent conservation, but let's do it with these visionary goals in mind, or these visionary kind of this framework in mind of this vision. By the way, Rupert Valley Holsteins there, also down your way. It's a great
Mark Flory.
Great project where, there's two phases to it. First, there was a 177-acre farm, a very productive farm there. And then a second phase project added 173 acres of forest land, sugar bush, ridge line, great natural resources, water resources. So often, again, when we work in communities, we're pairing those different values together. And that's the kind of conservation we think this calls for. That project also was in the area of 9 other projects that created a kind of conserved landscape that's connected and functioning and flowing through without sort of threat from development or mismanagement. So that's the big picture. That's the how and why. There are folks who are new here in this committee or to the body. So some of people have seen that already and know this in and out. Some of the more of this, or as I go forward, there might still be some stuff that's repetitive, but again, this is why we're doing the work. Now, what have we done so far? Well, here's the timeline you all set out, right? It was to first take about a year. It took us a little longer to say, what have we done already? And I'll get to the numbers in a couple slides here of what we've done already. But the answer is about a little less than 27% of the state we think is permanently conserved and fits into the categories in the bill. Although there's nuance and debate about all of it, but that's sort of VHCB's analysis and our recommendation is that that's about where we are. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is to build on that foundation a framework for investment and action, a plan. States all over the country have been doing this. We've looked at a bunch of those. I'll show you a couple of examples in a second, but this is the idea that you'd have a strategic set of guidelines and framework to achieve this, rather than just investing public money to who, kind of on a first come, first served basis is what we're trying to do, is to create some more strategic vision for how we do this at the statewide level, at the regional level, in communities and with partners across the state. All of that's where we've been really focused, and we've spent so much time and energy on this and focus. And then we have 25 years of implementation. So the real goal is, what do we create a platform from which to do focused strategic work that protects our landscape, that increases its functions and values? That's what we're trying to achieve in this goal. And that's what phase 3 would be all about. as we gathered, first in June, and then we revisited it and kind of resubmitted a document and an analysis last September. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but we consulted with a lot of people and tried to reflect the questions, values, concerns, ideas, hopes of a massive number of Vermonters through that first phase. So not only did we do some data crunching, but we also heard from a lot of people so that we have a really good sense, an inventory, if you will, of how we feel about conservation. What are the questions? What are the needs that communities have? And that came together early last summer, and then we spent the summer kind of refining our analysis and getting that together. So that was the phase one public process and engagement. And then there you can see the results show that 27% number. And it breaks down. We divided this into 4 categories. That's a huge asterisk because the bill has 3 categories. And it has a category that is natural resource management areas. And we found it was hard to distinguish and untangle agricultural and open land from some of the forest land. And that also we wanted to recommend the inclusion of that agricultural land in some way as we work towards these goals, to have a process that's a big tent that all these goals fit under. So one of the things we said in September is that while we work on this plan, we'd like to continue to think about how lands that are managed and can have a more of a impact on sensitive receptors, where there's more industrial use, the potential for impacts to water quality or to habitat. How do we set goals for that? What should we be trying to do between now and 2030, between now and 2050? And how would we include that in a 4th category that honors and looks at agriculture as a focal point, as its own focal point? Because agricultural conservation comes with like that Rupert Holstein's project that I described. It's 173 acres of ag and 177 acres of forest, or vice versa. And that's what conservation often looks like in Vermont, especially the work we've done with Vermont Land Trust and Upper Valley Land Trust, but also Stowe Land Trust, is that there's a lot of natural resource value to that as well. And we want to help those landowners continue to lean in to the idea that we all participate in creating a functioning and connected landscape. As we go forward, so we created that inventory, and we're trying to, right now I could do these in 6 different sequences, but I'm alluding again ahead that our funding for this next phase is somewhat insecure because it's federal. But this is how we would go forward, is roughly based on these segments that, we are right now taking stock of that inventory, thinking about how it forms the foundation. What have we already, there's so much that we learned from that helps us set the path forward, that we want to use that to kind of create the work product that guides the conversations as we go forward. We're also thinking about how to manage an inclusive stakeholder process. We've talked about how the law does not require a technical advisory committee, but the law does name a set of stakeholders, sort of different sectors that are interested in conservation. We'd like to make sure that they all are represented in a body that can give feedback to VHCB and ANR as we develop this plan going forward in an iterative fashion, that they would be there to review what we're doing, to give us feedback, to ask hard questions, and to say, this needs to include this, or we think it needs to include that. It doesn't give away the sort of the decision-making power that VHCB and ANR were directed to have, but it seems to us as a first way to collect the good ideas of people who are really close to that. But then also to create some technical advisory or sort of technical working groups that can help flesh the elements of a plan out. So when we think about a plan, what a lot of state plans look like is there's a set of objectives that's pretty broad, and then under those objectives there's pathways or strategic pillars or what have you, and then there's the set of actions that you need to build out under each of those pathways. That's what we see work groups really helping us to do, is to kind of build that out so that we know what the programs, practices, policies, funding, financing, the key performance indicators, the stakeholders, and the timetables, and how do we measure what we're doing, the actions we take to get to that 2030 goal or that 2050 goal. Based on those working groups work, across the bottom, not to be lost and definitely to be emphasized, is that we're trying to think about how to have stakeholders, especially at home in the places where conservation happens, give us feedback through the process, And so creating a process where we can work at A&R and VHCB, we can do a first level of review with a technical advisory group. We can ask for help from technical experts to flesh that out. And then we can hear from stakeholders, and then we can start that process again, refine it and go through that cycle. And we're trying to divide the year up into almost 3 cycles that look like that. It is still very formative. And before I say why it's still very formative, we've gone as far as we had an RFP in the fall when the federal landscape looked really different than it did now. And we did select a vendor. It's a vendor that's very familiar with Vermont. Future IQ has been in state for a few years. They helped the Department of FPR do the Forest Future Roadmap process. So, which is not the same process, not the same goals, but a lot of overlapping stakeholders and topics. So they're already familiar with Vermont. They have very strong communications and facilitation chops. And we're going to help them by really helping to deliver content to that process that they can facilitate with the stakeholders of this. So we feel really good about them, not just because they've been in Vermont, but also they do this all over the world, and they do it, their skills are translatable across a lot of different types of jurisdictions and clients that they work with. So that's, I've just got a couple more slides and there'd be plenty of, I know people, I can see questions building up behind the dam. But so this is a slide I wanted to spend a minute on though. This is a really, just to underscore that VACV has expended a lot of money that you've appropriated to us already to support this project. That wasn't necessarily appropriated just for this, but just general funds that came into the HCB we used to do the phase 1. There was an appropriation that we've used to create access. There's appropriation to A&R to help support. But we engaged over the last 2 years in the expectation, first in the hope and then the expectation that we'd have support from the Fish and Wildlife Foundation through an America the Beautiful grant. We were successful in getting that grant, although they cut our budget in half. And it's taken 2 years to get to the point where we're almost ready to begin seeking reimbursement. But we've also been notified that the funding is it's all funding is insecure. And this is true across VHCB's programs. A lot of what we do is at risk right now. There's a lot of commitments that we've made under federal programs and grants that if there's a federal shutdown or if organizations that are doing social justice work, implementing the Civil Rights Act, the kind of things that we do at VHCB, environmental justice, inclusive processes, that it would be hard and not what we want to do to say, let's use different words to try and describe this so we can skate under the radar. It would be almost impossible for us to do that because we are doing that work. And so there's a real risk that this particular initiative might not be funded by the feds. And so what this project would look like without that funding is something that we're just beginning to grapple with. Certainly VHCB is committed to delivering a plan and a framework, but it hasn't just been us that's been doing this work. A&R has done a lot more work than we were able to fund them to do. I mean, partners and stakeholders across the state have leaned in with very little or no compensation to be able to participate so far. And so that puts a real pall on kind of next steps right now. And it's causing us to go a little slower right now in these couple of months than we would ideally like to be going. If and when we get going, I mean, again, I don't want to, Gus does such a good job talking about projects, but I love what he does and how he communicates who we are. This is the kind of outcomes that we think about with Act 59, and it's across the different kinds of conservation programs that we currently implement or that we might strengthen and change and add to as we go on. But there's landscape scale conservation. Equinox Islands is an unbelievable landscape scale conservation effort that is all about the ecological values and connectivity, but also those recreational access and hunting, fishing, trapping, et cetera, down in southwestern Vermont. If you go down counterclockwise to Brattleboro, that's an example where we use conservation to then leverage floodplain restoration down on the Whetstone Brook. That project has been completed over the last couple of years by the Rivers Conservancy, and the flood storage improvement there is terrific. Again, that's not because of conservation only, that's because conservation leveraged investments in restoration. This was the site of a former sawmill that was deconstructed and the floodplain was reconstructed there. So community forests, and then I put the Maidstone, the community forest, the Wolcott Community Forest is one of our, like, what we want to see happen because of Act 59 is communities saying, how can we protect a huge swath of natural resources, create accessible access, more technical access, and protect all these water resources? It's next to a school. It's a fantastic example of the power of Act 59 in planning. And then Maidstone Bends is a place, it's another place that shows the duality of our work with agricultural producers, where there's a project there where we've invested not just in conserving a farm, but also over time phasing out production in fields that flood year over year and allowing a floodplain forest to restore itself. But it's being done in a very stepwise fashion so that the producer is not like off a cliff in terms of production. And it's not a very expensive project because it's using natural seed fall dispersal as the way to kind of restore that floodplain forest. So again, we get great rivers outcomes there, or river system outcomes, but also you continue to have a producer who's working. One of the key questions that Act 59 puts forward, and it's a directive in the mandate itself. So if you're familiar with the law, or even if you're not, Section 2803 sets out the goals for the plan, and it centers around Vermont conservation design, the framework built by ANR and the Fish and Wildlife Department there with input from across their programs to create a framework to understand what are the important attributes of the landscape to be protected. I know there are way better people than me that talk about this, but what we want to emphasize that as we're prepping and thinking about this phase 2 process and what a plan looks like is that centering VCD has to be across all the strategies, right? Ecological outcomes are the focus of VCD, ecological and community resilience outcomes, but that VCD is the framework to understand for every community what those would be. So that's ANR has been working very hard to understand and bring that to the what's currently protected within those spaces, what's not protected, and how do you engage communities in a way that doesn't overestimate what VCD is. VCD is not a regulatory tool. It's not a tap, your property can no longer be used for this or that. In fact, it's agnostic about how you protect the land, but it says these are the places to protect. So think about how you as a community want to center your values around that. Like I said, I won't spend much time on the slide because I already mentioned this, but we have spent a lot of time in the fall and recent months just kind of looking at how other states have expressed their plans, because we're not doing this in a vacuum. We really like California's approach, the way that they've expressed their plan and strategic pillars, but we have to adapt that. Their 30 by 30 law and administrative order are very different than Act 59. So we're not just replicating what they're doing, but just thinking, we think it's an effective communications strategy to say there are main objectives. The act lays those out pretty well, and then there's pathways underneath those and actions that build those out. And they've done a great job of that. They're also financed and funded in a way that's really different than we are in Vermont. So that's, again, not a perfect analog. This is not what engagement looks like, but we wanted to put something out there that just shows you the different layers of people who are working on this. If you center at the center of this, so yeah, there's nothing below the line there. We want to have a conservation plan that is informed by VHCB and ANR and our institutional knowledge and expertise, but that also has the benefit of technical advisors to our agencies, that has the inputs from technical working groups, and that throughout the process has touch points for people at home, stakeholders at home to see what we're doing, comment on it, give redirective suggestions, et cetera. And so coming to the end here, yeah, I think I like to usually just put up the picture of Green River Reservoir, because even if you're mad at me, you can just look at that, and it's a great place to pause. So that's the Act 59 update. For many of you, a lot of that's repetitive. And again, it will end by saying we're like all of you and like all of our sister and brother organizations around the state right now, we're in a moment of pretty great uncertainty around not just this effort, but how to do continuity of operations within our whole set of programs at VHCB. And so we're trying to keep momentum moving forward on this over the next 6 weeks. Not that there's a magic deadline at the end of 6 weeks, but it's we'll have a much better understanding of where we are with NIFWIF and our ability to use that grant to fund our process. But we also don't want to begin a process that we can't finish. So it's been a little frustrating for staff and for technical advisors and folks that we started to get into this, and now we're just leaning back on our heels just a little bit. That's our posture right now, as we understand next steps. So I'll leave it there and see what questions that you have. I have 20 or 30 minutes that I could stay for as long as you need.
Thank you for that. I guess I was hoping you were going to walk us through the inventory. And I appreciate that you're looking
Oh.
forward and that's where you're thinking, and perhaps I wasn't clear, or if you're not the right person to have do that. I see that that's the acreage inventory.
Yeah.
There were a number of questions that we asked you to report back on in the inventory, and you
Yeah.
did, but I thought that you would be
I have a document that
us through that.
I'd be happy to share with the committee, and I think we could do another process update later in the session too, and answer questions about that. But we have a really good synthesis of the inventory, and I didn't understand that was the exact assignment here, or else we could have done that. But basically, the way that the inventory section of the law was written was, one of the questions was what's conserved. It was one of 10 questions.
Yeah.
And so the other 9 questions are going to have helped us to form the basis of how we do our work going forward. But what I can share with you is a document that kind of summarizes what those 10 directives were, what the responses were, what stakeholders had to say about that as we went through it. And it's kind of organized into a package. So if we presented that to you,
Beyond this. I mean,
well, we have a distillation of it. Yeah.
So, well,
Which I thought might be helpful if people want something shorter than the whole.
it would be very helpful. I guess it'd be great to have you back and walk us through it so we can have questions and answers. That would be really helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Do members have questions?
Briefly. Yeah, thank you, Chair Sheldon. Trey, thanks for your presentation. Very, very good. Name's Rob North, representative of Ferris.
Okay.
Quick question. What are your opinions and your justifications for those opinions on including current use lands in the count toward the Act 59 conservation totals?
Well, we have said a couple times on the record here, and it's reflected in the analysis, that the current use program that exists right now does not, without other conservation, doesn't meet the definition of conserved in this bill. Right, this bill asks for the 2030 goal, right? So it says permanently legally conserved from conversion, and then it has to be a forest resource, a reserve area. It needs to be a biodiversity management area or a natural resource management area. So it has to also fit into one of those categories. Current use is just not, it isn't permanent. It's a fantastic program. It's a very important program in terms of educating landowners about the value of conservation. It's often a step from current use to conservation, and of the 2.3 or so million acres in forest land current use, I think 500,000 are probably also conserved. So there are a lot of people who do both. Sometimes the current use management requirements and the conservation easement requirements don't match too, and that's something that could be looked at. But no, we don't think that it should be counted towards the 2030 goal. It's one of the questions that we said in the inventory we'd like to continue to think about for the 2050 goal, because what the law says for 2050 is that 50% of the land should be protected largely, or I think it's just largely or mainly through permanent legal conservation, but also through durable long-term contracts and mechanisms to protect the land. So do we think that current use as it's currently written is a durable long-term protection mechanism? Maybe on the whole, but with respect to any particular parcel, it still just has that lien, and that lien is overcomable by an investment. So I think what we'd like to say is whether and how would you include that in the context of that durable program? And there'd be a half a dozen other state programs and other categories that you might throw in there and say, are these durable long-term protections that we want to count? But right as of right now, I think the answer is no, or at least that's what we recommended. We don't get to give the final answer. You do.
Right.
But our recommendation is that those
Opinion and your justifications. Yeah, the primary justification is that it just doesn't meet the law as true.
Yeah, but I also would say that current use and, if Keith Thompson were here or folks from FBR who have run the program, we could speak to the very, like, how current use meets landowners' needs and how important it is for a whole set of landowners and how permanent legal conservation meets other landowners' needs or other needs that some of those same landowners have. And that this law kind of respects that those are different programs that function in different ways. Current use has its parameters, legal conservation has its parameters. Sometimes the twain do meet, but sometimes it's kind of more stepwise. And it's good to have these different options out there. It's a fantastically successful program nationally. And I'll say as a landowner, it's how I got to know, it's how I came to this work was when I first worked with the forester to do my current use plan. And it excited me so much. I've kind of stayed with this all these years.
Can you say again, I think you gave an acreage for how many how many acres enrolled in current use are actually permanently conserved?
Well, I will say it again, only if you accept it as kind of a back of the envelope math problem. I know different partners out there have started to say, where is that? I think it's about 500,000 acres of overlap. Roughly speaking. And further caveated with the circle and stars I'm drawing right now.
Yeah. Representative Austin.
Yeah. In the public process, did you discern any kind of distinction between Chittenden County and outside of county in terms of responses?
In terms of responsiveness, not at all. People.
No responses.
Sorry, I was
okay.
going to get to that too.
Yeah.
I'm a frustrating conversation partner.
No, that's okay.
But so yeah, in terms of participation, we had participation from all over the state. In terms of the types of responses, not necessarily. I mean, I think the challenges and opportunities that Chittenden County has are unique to Chittenden County. Just like the challenges and opportunities for Orange County or Orleans County are unique to those places. So there's certainly a lot of people came to the inventory process to talk about what they valued, what mattered to them, or how they'd like to see Act 59 help them do what they want to do. So we've heard from lots of Chittenden County land trusts. There are a lot of small land trusts there who've said, how can we, what should we be thinking about? We also heard that from land trusts around the state as well, from local organizations. So I don't know that there was more different. The pressures we have seen in our work, that some of the pressures and butting heads of development and conservation in Chittenden County just are a little different than they are in some more rural counties of Vermont. And so the way that people think about conservation sometimes is, more along the lines of like promoting green space that is going to be part of the fabric of a community and happens to have this resource, as opposed to starting with, we've got this great resource. Let's build a community around this forested area. Like Wolcott is where they're working with us a lot right now and building a community that fits into the natural landscape. And we love the work we've done there. Chittenden County is kind of maybe going a little.
Representative Chapin.
Thanks, Jay. Can you go back to speaking a little bit more in depth about what you learned looking at other states' plans and you mentioned that there's some very different financing models out there, and I'm sure, every state is so unique. I would love to hear a little bit more about what your learning was beyond the messaging, which is less interesting to me, although it's very important.
I think the main takeaway we've seen from all these plans, and those are 5 that we've looked at that are pretty good, and that there's legislation that's similar enough to Vermont's to be relative. We looked at other jurisdictions around the world have done this as well. Quebec is our closest neighbor, actually, and they're working on a framework too. But one of the key takeaways is trying to think in a framework mechanism. What you're trying to do is create a framework for communities and regions to respond to the programs and opportunities that exist, right? Conservation is always it's always a voluntary transaction or action between a landowner who wants to protect their land and an organization or set of organizations that are going to work with them to do that. And so one of the big takeaways is using this planning mechanism to provide opportunities to those communities and to those landowners. And so doing a lot of doing a lot of listening through the process about what communities need, what's working, what's not working. And one of the big conversations we're having right now is like, how do we use the stakeholder, like the kind of cycles of hearing from people to make sure that, well, what we do isn't going to, again, tell you, Ella, this is what you and your family need to do with your land. Let's say to you and the people of East Montpelier, these are programs that if you wanted to protect this brook that runs through the back of Ella and Simeon's land and whatever, these are ways that you might do that. And so kind of like creating a framework that's easy to understand, that's communicated in multiple different formats to people, that you build sort of no wrong door entry points to it for communities and landowners and partners. That you really focus on another big piece of this is really focusing on what happens after conservation. So that's a big focus nationally and globally right now, is that I sort of said this earlier, but I'll say it again, that changing the legal status on a piece of land doesn't make it more or less of anything. It just changes what's in the land records. If we want that land to have function and value and productivity, we need to invest in it and take care of it. And so that's not necessarily the predictive outcome of Act 59, which is focused on bringing it into protection, but building a bridge from there to what you do. What is the value proposition for this afterwards? Is this just about blocking development? Or is this because a functioning and connected landscape actually makes all that development work much better? Makes the quality of people's lives better. So those are a couple of major takeaways, I'd say. A third, I guess, is that the human infrastructure needed to do this because of those needs goes way beyond just the sort of the implementing agency at a statewide level. We need to think about how, if this is the law of the state, and we're thinking about how to invest public money as well as to attract private investment to protect land in the categories that this bill defines, then we really want to make sure that communities around the state are like that it's easy for them to enter into that conversation. And that it doesn't feel like it's exclusive or it's only for this kind of land or this kind of landowner. But at the same time, the law is really clear that the land is that we can sort of categorize it. And so valuing all of that is important. Sorry, there's so much learning and that's like scratching the surface of it. But
Yeah, and I'm also interested in sort of financing models.
Yeah.
Longer term around implementation and, what other states are doing to specifically,
I think I didn't say this on the slide with ATV, but I meant to. And a lot of states have been counting on the Inflation Reduction Act and the Biden era kind of federal funding streams that were out there to implement these laws. And I don't know that we've seen anybody who's pivoted yet. California they've done a lot of bonding and they've done that and they've thought about this through the sort of general kind of resilience, flood resilience, climate resilience, and 30 by 30 is a component of that. And their voters have set aside an awful lot of money to do this over the next 10 years. But that's because they have a huge economy and the ability to do that at the statewide and regionally within California. I think it's not replicable to think that we could use only state public money in Vermont to close the gap to 2030. But with some additional investment at the public level here, whether that's state or federal, we are hopeful that a good plan and a good framework tax investment from landowners and from philanthropy, from foundations, et cetera.
Some of the feedback I've gotten, I guess, and I want to know, I know you've gotten it too, so how you're going to apply it to your next phase. I'll just say, I never imagined that you would have been as outward facing for the inventory portion of this work. And you chose to take it that direction, which is fine and probably good. But I think in so doing, perhaps risked and the feedback I'm getting is like, was a little bit opaque. How did you pick the partners? How are you going to do that going forward? I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Just who got on a subcommittee, how, and then how will you kind of take lessons learned to the planning process?
Yeah, well, the way that we thought about organizing, I mean, we used the stakeholder list in the statute from the very beginning of phase one, even though the statutory requirement to seek stakeholder input was really, it comes in that section that has to do with the plan. It was sort of a phase two mandate, but we did think that it's important to hear from people at the beginning, and that's part of the Vermont's environmental justice framework and just good practice to do that kind of like outreach. So originally, I think the first collection of people we have partnered with and that's who VHCB has partnered with for 35 years are the organizations who hold, finance, fund, conserve, steward lands in the state of Vermont. So the Agency of Natural Resources, the statewide and regional land trusts that, of that, millions of acres that are already conserved, there are about 7 organizations that are responsible for the lion's share of that stewardship and ownership burden. So that was a kind of a big, and that's still a big internal checkpoint for us. Just as my partner in the housing program, the director of our housing program is at VHCB, meets with the statewide housing partners, every quarter. It's really important to have those. The second layer was people that we, when we worked with Nature for Justice in phase one, we looked at those stakeholder groups and we also did a bunch of interviews and surveys where we heard back from people. And on the basis of that, we created all those different focus groups. And we tried to make them theme-based and affinity-based so that people could come based on kind of a common shared interest or a common sector goal or what have you, so that there was a place where we had, people who are really interested in one set of issues and, another, kind of focus group that's focused on a slightly different question. And so, what we thought we were trying to do was give as many people as much access to what we were doing and as much opportunity to tell us what they'd like on the record. And then we submitted that record to you along with our analysis of those responses and our recommendations about how to proceed. In order to Chair Sheldon referred to the 10 questions in the inventory section of this. In order to answer some of the harder questions there, we also invited partners to be part of work groups where they worked with us to frame out those responses. And I think that's where there was a lot of rub, was like who got picked. And we did our best to pick the people that we knew who would be able to help us to do that work and be productive and kind of get this inventory back to you all. But we felt like that was just phase one. Now it's, as going forward, much more important at each stage of this. What's going to happen at the end of this is there is going to be work product. It's going to be expressed in a narrative plan and online and stuff like that. And so what we're imagining is that, like, at each stage of the development of that we have a way to work through advisors who are people who are representative of those stakeholder communities, with technical experts who we think can help us to flesh out the elements of the plan, and then with stakeholder communities that we can visit with and get input from. But that's the process that we're going to be doing, is sort of bringing our organization of what we've learned so far in sort of 3 iterations, sort of as we're currently thinking of it, in 3 iterations back through that process of advisors and then work groups and then broadly public stakeholders.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My next question is about one of the intended outcomes of the inventory itself is just a really clear understanding of where we need to prioritize conservation dollars in the future in order to conserve representative natural community types across all of our biophysical regions. And Bob Zano gave us a little intro to work he's doing to kind of help pinpoint that. Can you speak to that and tell us a little bit more about what's in process and when we might see some more information on that?
Yeah, well, you'd have to ask Bob when he's ready to give you more. But what we're expecting from ANR and from Bob is an analysis of how would VCD help to prioritize actions and investments given the inventory we've already done. So what he's trying to do is overlay basically conservation design is an analysis of landscape functions and features in order to prioritize places for protection. We've protected some of those places with different tools. So he's going to be able to show us what we've done and kind of what comes next. Where that translates, I think, is in as we, first of all, as we think about the overall objectives of a statewide conservation plan, one of them is clearly centering VCD in our conservation investments. But then we imagine that that will manifest in several of the sort of strategic pathways or what have you, as well as be centered and part of the other strategic pathways. So Bob's work is going to literally result in the definition in the words that say this is an objective of this plan. These are the strategic pathways to deliver these goals and vision, and these are the actions that we're going to take to do that. There are other elements to Act 59 that complement VCD as a sort of overall framework, but that's what he's been working on. We haven't seen the final version of that. I saw an early version of it last fall at a conference that Bob and I were on speaking together. But I know he's doing a lot more work to kind of bring that down to the like, hey, this is what we think we need to do. These are the places, and I know they want to focus on connectivity points. They want to focus on helping old forests to mature. There's several things that get to not just the categories of Vermont conservation design, which describes these different landscape functions and features, but then the act itself says, we want you to think about forest reserve areas or biodiversity management areas through the lens of conservation design. Like where are the places that matter? But I have to reiterate, what sort of the art of this, not the science, is that still doesn't mandate any landowner to take any particular action. So what we have to express back to them in a plan is the opportunities to do that action and the reasons why. That's, it's very important that Act 59 lays out its findings of the importance of that connected and functioning natural working landscape. It's even more important that what we deliver helps people see themselves in that work at every level. That biodiversity can be in downtown Montpelier. It can be in Cabot at the headwaters of the Wadusky. It can be, in a project that direction at the confluence of the rivers where we had an historic house, but now we're going to restore a floodplain to reduce flood volume. Conservation is part of all those different things, and we should be targeting those different areas. That's what VCD I think will help us to do, is explain to people why.
Representative Pritchard, then.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding this clearly. In this inventory of 1.5 million acres, that's all public access land or no?
Not all of it is.
Okay, so how much of it is public access land? Do you know that?
I'll have to do some estimation work to give you an answer to that. So there's our partners at A&R own and manage about 375,000 acres, most of which is accessible for a variety of different public uses. We have there's a certain portion of that land that is also privately, owned or eased, and that ownership or easement is held by a municipality or a land trust. And much of that forest land is accessible, although private organizations can put more restrictions in a conservation easement than a public, than we do with public dollars at VHCB or A&R. Some of that land is like working forests where there are more restrictions because there's things that are happening there that we want to keep people safe from. And then some of that is on agricultural production areas where it doesn't make sense for the public to just walk into a barnyard. So I would say
about a fifth of the land is public access now.
No, I'd say probably closer to 3/5 or more. I'd say that a smaller portion of it is constrained. But on the privately owned and eased lands, you'd have to really look kind of parcel by parcel and organization by organization at how they allow people onto that land.
Would they eventually become public land access lands, or is that part of the plan, or is it just a
Access is a very important component to our funding. When we fund in a project, we almost always require public access unless it's like a barnyard, farmyard kind of agricultural production area or a private working forest that doesn't make sense. But that's generally our goal. What I don't think we're going to see from this is the change of if a private conservation organization is holding easements on a set of lands and there's that's not necessarily going to become owned by the Agency of Natural Resources as a result of this process. They're going to continue to hold that easement. So that continues to exist under that. Going forward, I think our decision is what is the character of lands that we consider? What do we want it to be? What's the mix of public and private ownership? And that's a really important question where like a lot of the forest land in Vermont is owned privately right now. And a lot of that is owned by people who are aging into retirement and are going to be making decisions about the disposition of that going forward. So, but that might mean that we help A&R acquire that land and then it's public land. Or we maybe help a municipality acquire that land as a town forest and then it's public land. But we might help the Nature Conservancy protect a piece of land and hold an easement on it that doesn't have all the same earmarks, but maybe still allows hunting, trail access, et cetera. But it sort of depends partner by partner on what the expectations are. And on a private parcel, sometimes the landowner says, I'd like to hold on to certain of these features, like timber rights or something like that. Sometimes there's conservation of the underlying land, but the timber rights are owned by somebody else.
I'm just trying to understand is the purpose,
Yeah.
you know, is the purpose to conserve land for the public or conserve land?
Both.
And try to figure out what that mix is.
Yeah.
But I guess it's hard with the private thing, and that's what you're gonna be dealing with because 75% of the land in the
That
state.
doesn't mean it wouldn't be
Right.
acquired by the state. And we, our partners, very important partner for us is Vermont Land Trust. They do a lot of farmland protection and forest land protection.
Yeah.
Forest land protection often includes public access for hunting, fishing, trapping, et cetera. But we also work a lot with the Agency of Natural Resources. They're a pretty important partner for us to protect lands. And then they are publicly, you're an owner. I'm an owner. We're all, get the t-shirt that says public landowner,
Yeah.
right? But going forward, we were expecting a really different funding environment, and that's going to affect who and where we look for our partners going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's not a better, sorry, there's not a clear
No.
answer. Yeah.
Representative Austin?
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm assuming the indigenous community had an opportunity to participate in the public input. Is that?
One of the focus groups that we did was with a group of leaders from the indigenous community. It's a place where we frankly should and could have done more.
Mhm.
And we've continued to work with members of the community to think about how to support their participation in a way that it provides both a sort of a better understanding of what we're doing with like this kind of legal conservation and the work we're doing under Act 59, but also learns from and incorporates into the vision for long-term management some of the values and traditional ecological knowledge values, et cetera. So we would like to invest more in pulling that community. There are a number of communities we'd like to pull towards this effort, and that's a key constituency.
Mhm. I'm just wondering about their vision or was it dramatically different or did it kind of align with, the more, a public,
I don't think there's a monolithic way, and I'm not the right person to
Yeah.
say what the vision
Yeah.
of the Vermont Indigenous community is, but we had a friend and, a contributor to our process who wrote an essay called An Indigenous Vision for Vermont that I'll send to you.
oh, great.
It's on our website, but it's just, it's very compatible. There are also language choices and mechanisms and kind of underpinnings of the way that property law works in a colonized place that are incompatible with the indigenous vision, some of the indigenous vision for landscape. Those tensions we're going to have to learn to live with because they're really hard to
Yeah.
unpack.
Yep. I'd love you to send that.
Yeah, I'll send you
That would
I'll send you
be
the paper
great.
as well as a link to, there's 6 or so perspectives that people contributed at our behest
Great,
to
thank you.
say how they felt about this.
Representative Tagliavia?
How many of the stakeholders that you're talking about are looking to preserve hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation like that in these easements, these preservation easements? So that, hunting, trapping, things that we've traditionally done throughout the history in Vermont, so that they are also preserved as well, including log working lands.
Yeah. I think most of the stakeholders think that all of those things are necessary for kind of a comprehensive vision for the landscape. Not, and I think most would agree that we don't have to do everything on every acre or every conserved place. And so there's room for kind of targeted differences in the way that we manage lands. The law itself speaks to kind of different categories of like sort of management. And so the law speaks to preserving places that where there would be less timber production and less even silvicultural management, other than kind of to, sort of to help natural processes evolve. And it speaks to protecting places that are habitats or where particular species are present, the sort of biodiversity management area, places like a WMA. Both of those are compatible, depending on the owner and depending on the way that the land is held. Both of those are absolutely compatible with hunting, fishing, trapping, wildlife watching, skiing in the woods, if there's trails, trail use, etc. And I think people think that that's really compatible. And then on the majority of what's already protected that we inventoried fits into that third category of natural resource management areas, where there's purpose of the easement may include access for recreation, access for wildlife watching, etc. The easement talks about the natural resource values of the land, but it also is there to promote enterprise, rural enterprise, whether that's silvicultural enterprise and logging and timber production, or agricultural production, or access that's part of the fabric of a place's economy. Like, what's one thing that's wonderful about a lot of our like trail groups is that they can do a lot of the work based on just landowner agreements. Vast, VIMBA, those kind of Trail and Greenways Council groups, like a lot of what they do is because people say you can cross my land. So a lot of that we get without conservation, but we want to do conservation that's compatible with that. And I think that's most of it. There are organizations who like, and again, VHCB, when we do funding, we're trying to fund access, we're trying to fund sustainable rural enterprise, we're trying to make sure that this works for communities. But there's a lot more conservation than just us. And there's certainly conservation that is more restrictive about some kinds of hunting or some kinds of access that organizations will restrict. And the question is, how do public dollars go into that? How do private dollars go into that? And how do communities get consulted to build an understanding of what the community wants and needs? Thank you. You're welcome.
Are there further questions? Representative Sapkowitz.
You alluded to the controversy over agricultural lands. And when the draft report came out, there was a hearing where you presented those results, including the agricultural lands. And a result of that presentation was then a further letter to VHCB expressing our interpretation of Act 59, that it did not include agricultural lands in the way that you included them. And yet when the final report came out, you still included them. I'd really like to know more about how you came to the decision to go against what I think was the rather clearly expressed interpretation from the committee and include them anyway.
Yeah, well, I think there was an important but nuanced shift from what we published in June to what we published in September. So I'd first say that we did respond. Secondly, I would say that we made our recommendation based on our values, and it was our recommendation that you think about conservation as being inclusive of those acres, because not only does the farmland conservation support a whole host of other natural resource benefits and values on every one of those parcels, but also conservation in perpetuity means that there's the opportunity for that land to be managed and held and restored or enhanced over time. And so when we looked at those two things together, that was the basis of our recommendation. And we knew that there was a group of, I think, 5 or 6 legislators who met last summer who disagreed with that recommendation. And we said, you have the right to disagree with VHCB and ANR about this, but this is what we recommend. And then when we refined it in September, we said, what we would like to do, there are many, many stakeholders who are very troubled by the framework of the act, pushing some things in and some things out. And it was very hard for us to come up with language and a framework that did that analysis, that had the consensus across a whole breadth of stakeholders. So we really retreated to our values and said, this is what we recommend. In September, though, we said, let us continue to look at this question. What we'd like to do is recommend whether and how to include conserved agricultural lands in their own category as a fourth category, and whether and how to set goals, specific goals for the conservation and protection of agricultural land by 2030 and 2050. And we said we would commit to doing that in this next phase of work. So that was probably not the full response that some people hoped for, but that was our change from June to September. And that's where we are now, is waiting to kind of get started again and then to include that question as we continue our work. There's been a lot of debate about this. I think it's frankly, it has, in my mind, has become of outsized importance to the need to have a comprehensive plan that implements this specific vision, which is a beautiful vision for the state of Vermont, and that allows us to go forward and pull funding and interest towards this effort. When, it cannot be gainsaid that there are impacts from agricultural land use that harm sensitive receptors. And there are also impacts from logging, there are impacts from development, there are impacts from roads, there are impacts from our septic systems, there's impacts from our wastewater treatment. All of those things are things that we try to manage. On the whole, we think the act of conservation really moves land into an opportunity where its value towards the collective vision of this is stronger. That it's distinct, and not that there are not unconcerned farms that are doing great ecological and connectivity work, but this is a tool that we wanted to include. That's where we landed, Representative Sackowitz.
I understand the point of that bigger picture, and I really do appreciate it. And I really do appreciate all the work that you all have done with leading us towards embracing and fulfilling that vision. It's extremely important, and I really am grateful. I do wonder, though, about in the more near term, it's getting to 2030, including that 3% or so, it brings us to that number percentage-wise, like kind of a lot faster. So it takes a lot of the pressure off conserving land in the near term. If our goal really is 30 by 30, I think that's where it's going to make the biggest difference potentially. It's instead of going from what would have been otherwise 24 to 30, we're going to go from 27 to 30. It's like it bumps us, like if we had 6% before, now we only have 3%. It's a big difference in the near term. And given the development pressures, given the other economic pressures on the state, it seems like it takes away a little bit of our urgency in terms of accomplishing our goals. That's my concern.
That I would be happy to tell you is not a concern that we share, that we'd somehow lose the urgency, because protecting another 189,000 or another 370,000 acres, both of those are very large tasks, and we're not stopping there. The goal is to do 50% by 2050. So that's why we'd like to say, what are the goals for agricultural protection over time? So that, because we also, you mentioned development pressures, we need to be really mindful of that. The development pressures on rural lands are most acute for ag lands that are flat, cleared, and well drained, and often marginally productive or economically useful for people outside of, a really good farm situation. And so there's often pressure on those lands to be converted. And so for us, there's great urgency to continue to highlight that. But also because every time we do those projects, it's likely that we're getting half of the property or more in wetlands and woodlands. So we are protecting lands that produce crops that can have an impact. They also feed us, which we think is part of the community resilience strategy of this act. And we think we need to do that. But we know that there's some real deep nuance to this that would be best to kind of continue to work on and continue to talk to you about rather than to hash out here. I'm not going to convince you, I don't think. But what we recommended is the right choice. And I don't think you're going to convince me that
I just think it's important to have some of that public conversation because you did allude to it.
yeah,
And we didn't really, I'm not sure everyone really knows what the history is or what. where that
absolutely.
actually came from.
And I think if we did come back and walk through the responses to the 10 questions, we'd have a time to really dig into that one in particular.
Yeah.
I would just want to say.
I was supposed to host a meeting in 7 minutes at my office. So for today, I was wondering if we could put not say that's not
I'm
important.
done
if
asking
you come back
questions. I
to it.
just do want to respond slightly to what you just said, which is that I completely share your thinking around the importance of agricultural lands. It's critical for Vermont. It's critical for us to be able to feed ourselves. And I don't think of it as a competing issue. We can do both. So I just want to be just super clear for the record that.
I think we're supposed to.
That it is really important to be conserving agricultural land for the long term. It's one of our highest priorities.
I read the act to say do both. But how we do it and how we count it, we don't all agree yet. So I want to live with that discomfort and tension.
And I'll add, since I was the author of the letter that Representative Sakowitz brought up and the bill here as introduced, the purpose of this really was to draw attention to the conservation of biodiversity. And in recognition of the fact that we've been doing a lot of great other types of conservation, it was never intended to take away from that. It was to say, and there's a whole host of other benefits and needs that society has around biodiversity. I think we're okay on the path we're on with what you're proposing, which was kind of always my intent was, well, we're going to have an agricultural goal and we're going to have a food resiliency piece of this, but we do need, I think, to keep track of the difference between lands for human use and lands for the rest of life on the planet. And it was really intended to say, like, it's time to elevate that to where all of this other great work was already happening. It wasn't to take away from it in any way. So, and I'm okay with where we're headed. I think we are in a little bit of murky waters. I appreciate that you've called out the ag lands in the inventory, keep track of them. We can stop talking about whether we can keep track of them or not.
We can all do the math the way we want to do the math is what I think.
We can, and I do think the conversation is to be continued. We will invite you back to go through the inventory. I appreciate you joining us today.
May I leave with one response to something that you just said, which is that we really want to, as we proceed, I think we want to narrow the places where we think of as being not for people. But even if we protect it as an ecological reserve, we're still thinking about that as a place that is important for people. And I don't think that's not what you said, but I just wanted,
Not what I said.
that's not what I,
It's 100% would be inaccurate to say that.
Yeah.
It was to let people know, yes, they needed other life on the planet.
yes.
So that's it.
We're in the middle of a sixth extinction that is happening at a rate and at a pace that we can't even understand. And whatever's happening out there is going to happen to us too. So it's important that we think about the rest of life on the planet. We are in vehement and violent agreement about that. And
Not violent.
well, table
Thank you
pounding.
for joining us.
Yes. Thank you. Leave it at vehemence.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care of me, right? I guess I gotta take that.
With that, members, we will adjourn for the afternoon.
Get that off for me or?
And,
I guess last one.
yeah, wait a second then, if you're. No, you can
It'll
just.
come down, Trey. We're
Trey,
about to close
well,
out.
yeah, I mean, she can
Okay.
invite you, you're gone.
Send me out as we go.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, I am just wondering where we left off with the cougar restoration, like. You know, I'm just wondering what the community thinks. I haven't been able to sleep. I'm so excited about it. I'm just wondering what everybody else is thinking about it.
Where,
And
yeah, I mean, I think it was a compelling presentation. I would love to hear what other members' responses were to it. I guess what I heard was that they were interested in pursuing a feasibility study if we were interested, or if, yeah, so that's kind of where I heard that conversation at the end of the presentation go. And if others have thoughts on that, I'm open. Anyone else sharing Representative Austin's enthusiasm and curiosity for the future of cougars?
Yeah, I think
Now
we
that
just
this-
gotta live another 60 years to see that.
I was on Zoom that day, but like, if there's a clear request to the committee, that would be helpful to understand.
Well, I think are we open to discussing what a feasibility study might entail and having that dialogue? Is that something we want to talk about?
You can have them back to hear what that would look like.
Good. And they also had a lot more data. I don't know if folks were interested in what was behind some of what Emily brought us. I mean, I'm interested in it. I think that the benefits of introducing an apex predator are pretty potentially very, very big. All right, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
With that, we will adjourn for the afternoon. We'll see you in the morning. And